Welcome to the Immigrant's Path, showcasing the successes, challenges, and the many paths to America. Brought to you by Sarraf Gentile LLP, a New York-based law firm representing individuals nationwide on immigration and other complex litigation matters.
Hi everyone, Joe Gentile. Today's interview is with part of the leadership team for ASSA, Kirsten Rambo and Amy Chung. They are a nonprofit who works to help immigrant survivors of violence, and they do this by providing trainings, excellent trainings, to attorneys that are looking to take on cases in this area. They handle some impact litigation, and they also do some advocacy work. I was very excited to have them on and interview them because I'm really very impressed with the work they do, and I want to bring more attention to it. So if issues surrounding immigrants and violence is something that resonates with you, if it's a cause that's important to you, I really strongly suggest that you check them out and consider supporting them. Thank you. All right. Welcome everybody to another episode of the Immigrant's Path. Today we have with us Kirsten Rambo, who's the Executive Director of ASSA, and we have Amy Chung, who is the Senior Legal Counsel to ASSA. So really excited to have you both here. Thanks for participating. So, you know, I've admired your organization for a while. We've been in touch for a while. So I really think that what you guys do and the place that you have in the nonprofit in the immigration world is really valuable and important. So I'm really excited to have this discussion, and to the extent that there's any lawyers or potentially affected immigrants that could benefit from knowing more about you guys, I'm really excited to put that out there. So first question, this is more for the listeners than for me. What's the purpose of ASSA? Why does it exist?
Well, first of all, thanks, Joe, for having us on. It's great to be with you today. And I can start us off on this one. ASSA's mission is to advance the dignity, rights, and liberty of immigrant survivors of violence. And for us, that usually means gender-based violence. So things like domestic violence and sexual assault and stalking and human trafficking. And so we were founded out of the recognition that people who are inclined to use violence against immigrants will often use their immigration status or lack thereof as a means of further abusing them, making them more vulnerable, and further controlling them. Mm. And so a big part of what we do is to try and make it so that abusers don't have those other forms of leverage or tools, you know, that they can't use the government or someone's immigration status as a way to further control or abuse the person that they're abusing, which is often an intimate partner.
Mm-hmm. And so what are the specific works that you guys do? What programs do you have to try to work towards, making an impact on these issues?
We have.
So, Sure, sorry. So our bread and butter, I would say, is training and technical assistance. So we provide training to attorneys and DOJ accredited representatives who are representing immigrants who've experienced violence. We also provide technical assistance, which is basically another way of saying consulting. And we have also been getting more and more involved in policy, advocacy, as well as litigation. And so we'll advocate on behalf of survivors with the immigration agencies like USCIS, like ICE, as well as with Congress. And then we also try to support people who find themselves in a place where they need to sue the government, whether it's because the government isn't doing what it's supposed to do, or there's been some other kind of abuse.
Can you give an example of the types of litigations that you've been involved with in the past?
Sure. So we had a very interesting case over the last year. So the background to this is that there is a particular type of immigration application called the U visa, and U visas are for non-citizens who have been victims of serious crimes in the United States and who cooperated with law enforcement in the investigation of a crime. And historically, for many years, there had been policies in place with ICE and with USCIS to make sure that people who were waiting for USCIS to decide their U visa application wouldn't be deported while they were waiting. Then in 2019, the acting director of ICE, Matthew Albence, issued a new directive removing these protections and basically making it much easier to remove people, to deport people who are waiting for a U visa application to be decided. And so we, along with our co-plaintiffs at the Sanctuary for Families, sued ICE over the legality of this policy that the former acting director put into place. And so through that litigation, we were able to get a stay in which ICE agreed not to remove the vast majority of U visa petitioners for a time. It was a temporary stay. And then ultimately they ended up withdrawing that policy and implementing a new policy that just came out this past August that is supposed to be more victim-centered.
And the trainings that you mentioned, who are those trainings mostly targeted towards?
They're heavily legal trainings. So they are really targeted towards immigration attorneys and other individuals who are working with non-citizen survivors in a legal capacity. So paralegals attend, legal assistants attend, DOJ accredited representatives also attend. One interesting thing in the immigration world is that non-attorneys are allowed to give legal advice to clients if they're accredited to do so.
You know, this is the aspect of what you guys do that really drew me towards your organization, because it's, to me, just the idea of training attorneys in particular to handle this type of work is such a force multiplier. There's other nonprofits out there that directly work with clients, and that's great. It's a necessary service, but I have to imagine that for every lawyer that you train, you have the ability for them to work with, however many clients they have capacity to work with. So it's such an incredible force multiplier with what you guys do on that front. So I think it's just such an intelligent way to go about making a dent in this. So anyway, that was my 2 cents on that.
Yeah. I'll also mention, I mean, we host a couple listservs, which are ways that that attorneys and advocates can brainstorm together and share that knowledge that they've gained. And so those have actually been really helpful as a sort of collective way for folks to also share the wisdom. And you might consider that a force multiplier as well. I love that phrase, but yeah, there's a lot of good stuff that happens on the listservs as well, because as you know, the law in this area is ever evolving. There are all kinds of new developments, and so it's helpful to have a space for folks to brainstorm and share collectively as well.
So this is for each of you individually. Working with issues around abuse and gender violence just doesn't seem to me as the type of thing that somebody just kind of stumbles into. If you can, just walk us through, how did you arrive at picking this as being kind of a focus of your work, of your careers?
you want to go first, Amy?
Sure, although I will say that I did kind of stumble into it. So I have been very interested in immigration issues generally and immigrants' rights for a very long time. And so then the question was how to do it. And so I ended up going to law school, ended up working on an asylum case and other humanitarian type cases when I was in law school. I think the thing that most likely led me down this path is that I was always very interested in public interest work, and a lot of public interest related immigration work has to do with humanitarian benefits. And you know, all of what we do is humanitarian benefits. Obviously, there are other types out there as well. But I think that when you're talking about the immigration system, ultimately, whether you're talking about business or employment-related immigration or family-based or humanitarian immigration, I think what it all ultimately speaks to is the idea of universal humanity and universal human rights. And I think that that's true across the immigration field. I think it's especially clear when you're working with these types of applications.
Kirsten?
Yeah, mine is a little bit different, but I would say sort of complementary path to what Amy described, because I have been interested in issues of gender and feminism for a long time, and part of the way that I got my start on that was with the Institute for African American Studies, where I was in grad school, and so this pull toward a kind of intersectional analysis of feminism is sort of where I began. And so my graduate work was in women's studies, it was then called, and the research that I did and the teaching and work that I did was in gender-based violence, and specifically most of that was concentrated in domestic violence or intimate partner violence. And the folks, so I had this academic side because I was doing my PhD, but on the sort of more applied side, I was working in the Atlanta area locally, and it just happened that the folks and the groups that I was working with, many of them were culturally specific organizations that dealt with particular immigrant communities, and so those were some of my earliest introductions to the field, my earliest mentors. And so I kind of came at it that way through gender and gender-based violence and working with organizations, some of whom were serving a broad array of immigrant communities, and some of whom were serving specific immigrant communities. But so that's kind of been my path. And I will say that people often say to us that it must be so depressing, or it must be so just it's obviously a difficult field, but I have found that I've worked in direct services, and I've worked in our work we're not representing survivors directly, right? But there is the flip side of the trauma that folks go through, and understanding and knowing that and working with that is that you get to see the resilience that people have, which is really astonishing. And the resilience of immigrant survivors in particular is just, it's jaw-dropping, and it's really it's an honor to be part of that process, and to be contributing to that in whatever way we can to help support that. So
you teed up my next question very well, so thank you. I had kind of a question that I was thinking of selfishly for myself, but I'm sure that there's other people that work with clients that have gone through trauma, have the same issue. So this is really for lawyers, social workers, and other professionals. Most of the people that I've met that do this type of work have a high degree of empathy. It's just kind of part and parcel with being drawn towards this type of work. And one of the issues I think that people with a lot of empathy struggle with working with clients that have had a trauma, and this certainly fits that category, is the concept of vicarious trauma. I don't know if I would describe it as depressing, but when you do work with clients that have been through a trauma, you take on part of that yourself. And so if you're not skilled and mindful as to how to handle that, it's a really easy way to develop burnout, or even to just in a self-protective way to lose your ability to have some compassion. So my question is what should professionals that work with clients that have been through trauma be doing to try to protect themselves from vicarious trauma? And what are some of the signs that they should be mindful of to look into of themselves to see if it's something that's kind of creeping in?
I mean, I've got to say, I'm not an expert on this area. I think that this is something that, you know, everybody who works in this field or in any field where you're doing direct representation and we're working with traumatized individuals, it's a process for everybody. And I think everybody handles it in their own ways. And there are people who are much more expert on this than I am. Yeah. I think that for myself, I tend to think that, you know, we oftentimes recommend counseling and therapy to our clients as a way of trying to help them cope with what they've experienced. And I think that sometimes we are reluctant to take that advice for ourselves. And I think that making sure that that employers are also proactive about making sure that their staff are not getting burned out is really important. And I think that's hard for a lot of organizations to do. We're oftentimes talking about very small nonprofits here, and it's a challenging thing to do. But otherwise, you do have burnout, you do have turnover, you do have, you know, sometimes a sense of becoming more jaded over time as you're working with clients. And so it is an ongoing struggle for a lot of people.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's something I definitely struggled with personally earlier in my career, working with people. I guess I really wasn't prepared to deal with that. You know, I've always worked with clients, I think, closely and have had a high degree of empathy, and it just kind of blindsided me at some point and kind of crept in. So, yeah, I mean, a little older, a little wiser, I know kind of to look out for it more myself now. So, Kirsten, you're on mute. Oh, is it because of the dog? Okay.
Yeah, sorry. I'm so
All
sorry.
right. No problem. So Kirsten, is this something that you've dealt with in your career as well? I know you mentioned you've worked with people directly. So do you have any advice or tips for professionals on kind of how to manage that?
Yeah, it's definitely something I've dealt with, and I really appreciate the question because I think the first step is we need to talk about this, you know, as a community, as a field, and it is a thing that sometimes folks shy away from, and it can be very isolating where, you know, if you're in it, you can feel somehow like you might be the only one in it because when you look around at your colleagues and other professionals, you can tell yourself or believe that everyone else seems to be doing just fine, so it must be just me. And so I think I really appreciate you raising it. It's a very thoughtful and important question. And you know, I also am not an expert in this arena, but I fully agree with what Amy said, and I think you know, that path is often, you know, therapy and counseling, like, can't recommend that enough. And then, you know, there are other, it's all the things that often are in that category of self-care, which is a phrase that gets used a lot, and a phrase that has become kind of a buzzword, but I do, and you may have experienced this yourself. It's very hard to be effective in your job when your reserves are just empty, and they can quickly get empty listening to folks, share about their trauma throughout your day. And we all bring our own life experiences to this work, and whatever has happened to us that day outside of work, so hearing and empathizing with folks' trauma can just compound that. So, and I think you're right. It is really empathetic people that are drawn to this field. So I don't think anybody has a magic wand on this, but there's so much. There are so many good ideas out there around self-care, and they're the same ones that they are for everything else, which have to do with, eating well and exercising. I mean, the things that they almost sound trite, but they can be the secrets to keeping yourself well and whole and going.
Right.
And also, knowing when you need to step back. And it's different, right? When you've got your own practice versus, like Amy was talking about, with, many of our members are part of organizations, whether it's law firms or nonprofits. And so having institutionalized approaches that recognize that for frontline staff, for folks who are interacting with clients, burnout is a real thing. And the idea is to have some practices in place to prevent that before you're dealing with folks who are burnout. And I know you asked about signs to watch for, and I think it's that it can be the Sunday night dread, or the morning dread, or finding yourself feeling or appearing to be less empathetic than you're used to being, right? And just kind of checking out more in times when you're used to being real tuned in. And, as I said, I'm not an expert, but these are things that I've seen and that I think are pretty well recognized in this arena. I want to ask you what strategies you found, but I know that's not the direction. I'm not supposed to be interviewing you for this.
No, it's fine. I'm happy to answer that. I would say it's two things. It's a combination of everything that you described, and what I would add additionally to that is I kind of view a lot of the sorry, there's a lot of horns in the back. The self-care aspect of it for me is a way to kind of manage the gas tank getting emptied at a slower pace in a lot of ways, but it doesn't refill the gas tank necessarily, or it doesn't make the process of the work add to the gas tank. And so for me, the second part of the trick was how to make the work that I do more additive to the gas tank, if this analogy makes sense. And the way I do that is to try to be less focused on the results of the work that I'm doing, to not be so hung up on the winning, the losing, the final result, but to be more focused on being faithful to the role I'm trying to play in a person's life, or the role I'm trying to play in a system. So I feel like if I focus more on that, it's easier for me to feel charged about what I'm doing than if I'm focused and kind of worrying about a particular result coming to fruition. Again, I'll give the same qualifiers you guys gave. I'm not an expert. I'm just speaking from my own personal experience. But for me personally, that's made a difference.
Yeah, it's such a great point, particularly because in this field, any results are usually so extremely long term that you have to find ways to mark those successes along the way, or as you said, just sort of engage on the level of the role you're playing in someone's life, because there are pieces of it that are just really well out of your hands. And
there's a lot that's out of our control.
Yeah.
So the next question I have is, I think this should be geared more towards Amy. So Amy, this is, I'm asking you to give, a 4-hour answer in a very short, quick summary, but just what are for an immigrant that is in an abuse situation, whether they have a green card or not, what are the basic legal tools that are available to help them kind of secure their status if they're going through an abuse situation?
So I think the first thing is always about the person's personal safety, right? I think for a lot of people who are experiencing an abusive situation, that immediate need to find safety can be the most pressing issue. And there can be a lot of issues that are going on aside from the question of their immigration status that can be much more pressing, such as if they don't have stable housing, right? Aside from that, when you are talking about the immigration options, I think that one of the key things is to talk with somebody, to talk with a qualified immigration legal representative, whether that's an attorney or an accredited rep. And unfortunately, I think one of the things that we find in immigration is that there are a lot of unethical individuals out there who take advantage of people. And are ultimately doing a lot of harm when they are, sometimes missing deadlines, sometimes filing very poorly done applications, sometimes filing applications for things that the person was never eligible for, right? And so I think making sure that people are accessing qualified representation, ethical representation is incredibly important. And for many people, there is some kind of option out there for them that could help them stabilize their status. I think whenever we're talking about immigration and the law, we also have to recognize the fact that there are people for whom there isn't actually a readily available option to fix their status, right? And so I think we have to recognize that fact. But I think that talking with ethical qualified counsel is the first step to figuring out what is there and whether they can access that.
And so for the people that do have a solution, let's say there is a legal solution, this is more of a systemic question than it is towards a particular individual, but systemically, for an immigrant that's in a domestic abuse situation, what are some of the common tools, I guess, that they have available to help with the status issue? So I know you mentioned U visas earlier. Is U visas, for instance, something that's used commonly to assist in that situation?
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, it is, there's a lot of crime in the United States, and a lot of non-citizens are targets of crime, right? And so unfortunately, a lot of people are eligible for U visas. It's probably the most common humanitarian-based application other than asylum. And there are probably even more people out there who are eligible for it and who just don't know or haven't been able to file an application, right? And so there's the U visa. There's also the T visa, which is for survivors of human trafficking, whether that's labor trafficking or sex trafficking. We also work a lot with VAWA self-petitions, which are for certain family members of US citizens or lawful permanent residents or green card holders who have been abused by that citizen or permanent resident. And there's also the I-751 domestic violence waiver. So this is for people who have conditional permanent residence. Some people call this a 2-year green card. And if they're experiencing abuse, then they can submit a particular type of application in order to remove the conditions on the residence and get their permanent green card.
And so if I'm an attorney or a professional that doesn't work regularly with people in abuse situations, is there any signs I should be looking for to see if that's potentially an issue? Because I imagine a lot of people, and this is, I mean, especially depending on the culture you come from, they're not necessarily forthcoming when you first meet them that there is an abuse situation in their home. So are there any signs to kind of look for to kind of tip you off that maybe this is an area you should be probing into a little more?
Wow. I mean, there is potentially a lot there.
Right.
I think one of the things is who you're talking to. So sometimes you might have attorneys who are working with both spouses and they're talking with them together, but because they're working with both of them, they might not have an opportunity or might not, take the opportunity to speak with them individually. And so, taking that time to speak with them individually and making sure that their interests are aligned, that, things are okay at home, I think is something that people can watch out for. I think that it's difficult when you're representing both spouses, right? Because you obviously have a duty to both of them at that point, right? And so there can be a lot of professional ethics issues that come into play. But certainly watching out for issues related to control, for are you being restricted in accessing and speaking to one of them? I mean, these are kinds of issues around isolation and control that are kind of classic indicators of domestic violence.
And so again, if I'm an attorney and I see these signs and I decide that this may be something worth probing into, I'm sure this can be an entire training, but are there any sensitivities or any recommendations about how to kind of arm yourself as an attorney to kind of go into that probing in a way that's respectful of a person's trauma situation and not kind of, unintentionally kind of re-traumatize them or handle it in an insensitive way?
I think it's very case by case. I mean,
Yeah.
I think that ideally at that, you've gotten to know your client a
Hopefully.
bit at that point,
Yeah.
hopefully, right? And so at the point where you start probing to try to see what's going on, you've probably noticed some kind of red flag that made you, start that line of questioning, right? And so I think, making sure that the person that you're talking to is in, a safe place that they can speak confidentially, to explain, I think, why you're asking those questions, I think is important, and to talk about the confidentiality of what the person is telling you. And I think that's an area where it can be really tricky for attorneys who are engaging in dual representation and what that means for confidentiality when you've got two clients. I think another thing that people could consider is making connections to other resources in the area. So for example, there are domestic violence shelters, there are domestic violence hotlines, there are domestic violence counselors to whom you can refer somebody for follow-up on any red flags that you've noticed, right? Because those people are really specialized and expert in talking with people about abuse. And so sometimes it's knowing who to send the client to that can be the first step.
Okay. And now to just kind of look at this issue from another perspective, because some of the people that listen to this podcast, they're not all attorneys or professionals. Some of them are immigrants themselves. So if I'm in the shoes of being an immigrant that is suffering from domestic violence or severe emotional abuse, what are the first steps I should be taking to protect myself, and where should I be initially looking for help?
I think this gets back to the question of personal safety. I think making sure that you're in a place of safety, that your kids are in a place of safety, I think, is going to be a lot of people's primary concern. It's very difficult to, start working on an immigration legal case when you're experiencing, when you're not physically safe at home, right?
Yeah.
And so I think for a lot of people, that's the first step. And so whether it's an issue of, an emergency need to call 911, if it is a question of reaching out to a domestic violence hotline, trying to get to a domestic violence shelter, I think for a lot of people that just depending on the situation, for some people, that's going to be their first step. And just trying to make sure that they're in a safe enough place that they can start thinking about the legal issues, right? Whether that's going to be, divorce or custody or child support or immigration, right? So I think just depending on the person's situation, it can be different. But when you have issues of personal safety, I think starting with, that first line of response to is the first step.
You kind of go through, it sounds like, the hierarchy of needs in a way, starting at the most basic, safety, and then shelter after that. And then after that, you kind of go up the pyramid towards the legal issues.
Yeah. I think for a lot of people, the immigration legal issue, certainly it's important, but, when you're talking about comparing the need to stabilize your immigration status and the need to find some place to sleep tonight, like they're sometimes much more urgent pressing issues.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So,
can I just add on to that?
Yeah, sure. Quick? Please do.
Just to fully agree with everything Amy said, and also note that obviously there are some folks who aren't going to be comfortable calling 911 for lots of reasons. And so two things. One, for the attorneys listening, I want to put in a plug to get to know your local domestic violence resources. It works so much better when when those relationships are already in place. It can be a much more easy referral, a more coordinated and holistic approach if you know who you're calling. And so we love that approach when attorneys and domestic violence or sexual assault advocates are working together. It almost always makes things go so much better for the survivors who need the services. So that's one thing I would say. And also just, for folks who may need help, to know that, your local domestic violence organization, typically their funding requires that they serve you without regard to your immigration status. They're not agents of ICE or the government in that way. I don't want to put that out there as a blanket thing, because there's always going to be that one case where some organization is not following the rules or whatever. But broadly speaking, domestic violence organizations should be safe places for folks to go to get services, to call, to go to for shelter, for counseling, for all kinds of things, without any regard to their immigration status. And many of them will have language access programs in place, not as many as we would like. But those services are out there and available. There's also a national hotline, depending where folks are, that will connect you with the organization in your area that can serve you. And I can give you that number if you're interested.
Sure. Do you want to?
Yeah, it's 1-800-799-SAFE, SAFE.
Okay.
So that's a way. If you don't know the folks in your area, you call that number, they can connect you with whoever's local to you.
Right. Yeah, I can put that in the description in the notes section of the podcast, so this way that comes up when somebody's viewing it or listening to it. So just a couple of final things. I just wanted to put in kind of an appeal for ASSA. Again, as I said in the beginning, I think the work that you guys do is fantastic. I really like the approach of training attorneys and other professionals to train, another dozen set of hands to help. I think it's really smart approach. So if issues of immigration or domestic abuse or both or something that's important to you, I really suggest that you look more into ASSA and consider making a financial contribution. And if you're an attorney and you're looking to add this as another practice area, either to do it pro bono or otherwise, this is also a great resource to learn the skills or sharpen existing skills. So I'd really encourage people to check you guys out. So if people want to follow through with that and check you out, what is the best approach for them to do that?
The best
Website
approach
or yeah.
would be, to go to our website, which is assistahelp.org.
Mm-hmm.
So we're ASISTA
Mm-hmm.
help, HELP.org.
Mm-hmm.
And thank you for that. Of course, I mean, this is how we're nonprofit. So,
Right.
so donations are a large part of how we do what we do. If you are an attorney and you're looking for trainings and support like that, that's what our membership is about. And I wanted to flag too, because I loved your question about how attorneys can handle when there are clients that they suspect are dealing with issues of, for instance, domestic violence. And we did just have a training on trauma-informed lawyering back in August. And that's something that folks could find on our website too, that's full of really practical tips of how to engage when you're sort of, many attorneys will feel nervous about, I don't know how to approach this, or will I get it right? And we had a great training on that. It's only an hour, but it's up on our website as well if folks wanted to check that out.
That's great. Okay, is there anything else we didn't discuss, didn't come up that you guys like to bring up before we go? Either of you?
I mean, I'll say that we're very happy to have you as a member, Joe.
Thank you.
Our membership, I hope you feel this as well, but it's a really nice community of practitioners across the nation, supporting each other. We're certainly, supporting our members too, and in navigating this realm on behalf of and with immigrant survivors of violence. So I'm just grateful to you and all the folks who are doing this good work, and thankful to be here with you today.
Oh, I really appreciate that. Thank you. It was very nice. All right, Amy, if you don't have anything else, I guess we'll close it out.
Sounds good. Thank you so much for inviting us to join you on the podcast. And we certainly look forward to hearing it.
Yeah. I really appreciate you guys being on. This was great. I think it could help a lot of people. So I really appreciate your time. Thank you.